The sound that stopped everything wasn't a shout or a scream. It was the quiet, humiliating thud of knees hitting cold tile. It echoed more loudly in the woman's chest than it ever could in the room itself. The bucket slipped from her hands, tipping sideways, and cloudy soap water rushed across the kitchen floor, creeping into the seams of the tiles and soaking the hem of her worn uniform. The fabric clung to her skin, heavy and cold, as if even the floor was claiming its share of her dignity. For a moment, she stayed there, frozen, not because she wanted to, but because her body refused to respond. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, fingers stiff and swollen from hours of scrubbing. She tried to inhale deeply, the way she had taught herself to do during harder moments in life, but her chest felt tight, compressed, as though the air had thickened without warning. Each breath came shallow and quick, panic fluttering beneath her ribs like a trapped bird. She pressed her palm against the tile, intending to push herself up. The floor was colder than she expected. It sent a sharp chill through her bones, a reminder of how exposed she was. Her knees ached fiercely, a deep, throbbing pain that felt older than the moment itself, as if it carried the memory of every year she had spent bending, lifting, enduring. Above her, a voice cut through the stillness. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. It was sharp, precise, polished by habit, a voice that knew it would be obeyed. "Do it again," the woman said. Her tone was controlled, irritated, practiced to perfection. "I said clean it again." The words landed heavier than any raised voice could have. They weren't spoken in anger, but in certainty, in ownership. The woman on the floor closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. She felt the familiar burn behind her eyes, the pressure that came right before tears. Her throat tightened, and she swallowed hard, forcing the feeling down. "Not here," she told herself. "Not now." She had cried before in her life. She had cried when her husband died and the world felt suddenly unsafe. She had cried in quiet rooms when bills stacked higher than hope. She had cried into pillows so her child wouldn't hear. But this was different. This was not grief, this was humiliation, slow and deliberate. She reached again for the counter, her fingers brushing the edge but failing to grip. Her arms shook, muscles protesting. Her body, loyal for so many decades, had finally chosen this moment to betray her. "I'm trying," she said softly. Her voice surprised her. It sounded smaller than she felt, thinner, like it might disappear if pushed any harder. The woman standing above her sighed, an exaggerated sound of impatience. "Trying isn't enough. I don't like excuses." The woman on the floor nodded instinctively, even though she hadn't been asked a question. Old habits, survival habits. She shifted her weight, attempting to rise again. Pain shot through her knees, sharp and unforgiving. Her vision blurred for a second, the edges of the room fading in and out. She paused, embarrassed by the pause itself. Around her, the kitchen was spotless. The counters gleamed, the sink shined. There was no visible mess left to clean. And yet, she was still there, on her knees, because cleanliness had never really been the issue. Her thoughts drifted, uninvited, to another kitchen long ago, smaller, warmer, a place where she had stood for hours cooking meals from almost nothing, humming softly while a young boy sat at the table doing homework. She remembered the sound of his laughter, the way he used to look up at her as if she were the safest place in the world. The memory tightened her chest even more. A sudden creak broke through the moment. The front door. It opened slowly, its hinges making a familiar sound that usually went unnoticed. This time, it felt thunderous. Footsteps followed, measured, confident. They moved through the entryway and stopped abruptly. Silence swallowed the room. The woman on the floor felt it before she saw anything change. The air shifted, the sharp presence above her stiffened. Something unspoken passed through the space, something heavy and undeniable. She lifted her head slightly, her neck aching as she looked toward the doorway. A man stood there. He was tall, dressed impeccably, his posture straight, his expression unreadable at first. But then his eyes adjusted to the scene in front of him. They moved from the overturned bucket to the wet floor, to the trembling hands pressed against tile, and finally, they landed on her. Recognition struck him like a physical blow. The color drained from his face so quickly it was almost alarming. His lips parted, but no sound came out. His eyes widened, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous: understanding. For a brief, suspended moment, no one spoke. The woman above the kneeling figure turned slowly, following his gaze. Her expression shifted instantly. The irritation vanished, replaced by a practiced softness, a smile that appeared too quickly to be genuine. "Oh," she said lightly, "you're home early." The man didn't respond. His eyes never left the woman on the floor. She met his gaze then, really met it, and in that instant, every emotion she had been suppressing surged forward. Shock, shame, relief, fear, love, regret. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. He took a step forward, then another, as if drawn by an invisible force. His voice, when it finally came, was quiet, strained. "What is going on here?" The woman standing above laughed softly, brushing imaginary dust from her sleeve. "Oh, nothing serious," she said. "She made a mess, and I asked her to clean it properly. That's all." The words hung in the air, thin and fragile. The man's gaze dropped again to the woman still kneeling, her uniform soaked, her shoulders slumped in exhaustion. He noticed details he had never seen before: the redness of her hands, the way she leaned slightly to one side, favoring her aching knee, the effort it took for her just to stay upright. A memory surfaced without warning. A different woman, years ago, kneeling beside a small bed, playing quietly before turning off the light, hands rough from work, but always gentle when they touched him. His chest tightened painfully. "Get up," he said suddenly. The woman on the floor flinched, startled. She hesitated if she had heard him correctly. "I said, get up," he repeated, more firmly now. She tried again, pushing herself up slowly, her movements stiff and careful. Her knees screamed in protest, but she bit down on the inside of her cheek, refusing to make a sound. The woman standing nearby opened her mouth. "Darling, she hasn't finished." "That's enough," he interrupted, his voice sharp now, edged with something she hadn't heard before. Authority, yes, but also anger, restrained and dangerous. The room felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls themselves were listening. The woman who had been kneeling finally made it to her feet. She stood unsteadily, eyes lowered, hands clasped tightly in front of her. She felt exposed, like everyone could see straight through her skin to the years of sacrifice underneath. The man stepped closer to her. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. She shook her head automatically. "No, sir." The word felt wrong the moment it left her mouth. He studied her face, the lines at the corners of her eyes, the familiarity he had somehow missed, the strength still there despite everything. His heart pounded in his chest, a deep, unsettled rhythm. Behind them, the other woman crossed her arms, impatience flickering briefly across her features before she smoothed it away again. "I don't understand why this is such a big deal. Staff need to learn standards." The man turned slowly to face her, and in that moment, something irreversible began. The woman who had been kneeling felt it too, a shift, a crack forming beneath carefully constructed surfaces. She didn't allow herself hope, not yet, but something warm stirred faintly in her chest. This wasn't the end of her humiliation, but it was the beginning of the truth. Margaret had learned that lesson early in life, though she hadn't had words for it at the time. People revealed themselves most clearly when they believed no one important was watching. Not when they were being praised, not when they were surrounded by admiration, but in the quiet spaces, when power felt secure, when appearances no longer needed polishing. That was when truth slipped out, unguarded and honest. She had seen it in neighbors, in relatives, in strangers passing briefly through her life. She had seen it in grief and in success, in moments of desperation and moments of abundance. And she had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, to trust her instincts even when logic tried to argue otherwise. Her own life had never been loud or dramatic. It was shaped instead by endurance, by small decisions repeated every day without applause. She married young, full of cautious hope, believing in the promise of partnership and shared effort. For a time, that hope was rewarded. She and her husband built a modest but warm home, one filled with laughter, shared meals, and quiet dreams about the future. Then, without warning, life changed. Widowed young, Margaret found herself standing at the edge of a reality she had never prepared for. Grief came first, sharp, consuming, relentless. Then fear followed close behind. Fear of raising a child alone, fear of financial uncertainty, fear of becoming invisible in a world that often overlooked women without protection. But she did not collapse under it. She mourned privately, late at night, when the house was quiet and her son was asleep. During the day, she stood up straight and did what needed to be done. She worked when work was available. She learned to stretch meals, to mend clothes instead of replacing them, to turn scarcity into something survivable. Her son, Daniel, became the center of her universe, not in a suffocating way, but in a purposeful one. Everything she endured had a direction. Every sacrifice pointed toward his future. There were nights she went to bed hungry so he could eat a full plate. She told herself she wasn't hungry anyway, that tea was enough. There were years she wore the same faded dresses, carefully washed and pressed, while paying for his school books and tuition. When shoes wore thin, she replaced his first. When choices had to be made, she chose him without hesitation. And she never complained. Not because it wasn't hard, but because she believed hardship didn't need an audience. She raised Daniel with discipline, not cruelty, with structure, not fear. She taught him to greet elders properly, to say thank you, to look people in the eye, regardless of their position. She corrected him when he was careless with words. She praised him when he showed empathy. She reminded him often that success meant nothing if it stripped away kindness. Character, she would say, is what you do when no one is clapping. Daniel absorbed those lessons the way children do, not always consciously, but deeply. He was curious, intelligent, driven. He asked questions about everything. He wanted to understand how the world worked, why some people had so much while others struggled just to survive. Margaret encouraged that curiosity, even when it frightened her. She knew education could take him far, from her, from familiarity, from the simple life she understood. But love, she believed, was not about holding someone close. It was about preparing them to stand on their own. And Daniel did. He excelled in school, he earned scholarships, he climbed ladders Margaret had never even seen before. Over time, his name became one people spoke with respect. Boardrooms welcomed him, government offices returned his calls, charity events sought his presence. To the world, Daniel Okoye was accomplished, confident, impressive. To Margaret, he was still the boy who used to wait by the door in the evenings, peeking through the window until she saw her coming down the street. Still the child who once cried because she worked late and he missed her. Still the young man who called her for advice even when he pretended he already knew the answer. She never interfered in his adult life. She believed deeply in boundaries. Children raised well, she thought, deserved the dignity of their own choices. She offered guidance only when asked, prayers even when she wasn't. So when Daniel told her he was getting married, she smiled. Not a polite smile, a real one. She was proud of him, proud that he had built something solid, proud that he had found someone he wanted to share his life with, proud that her sacrifices had not been wasted. The woman he planned to marry was everything people admired: polished, elegant, confident. She moved easily through social spaces, spoke with charm, dressed impeccably. She came from a respected background and knew exactly how to present herself around influential people. In public, she was flawless. Margaret watched quietly, the way she always had. At first, she told herself she was simply adjusting. Change always felt strange, especially when it involved sharing your child with someone new. She dismissed her discomfort as unnecessary worry, the kind mothers sometimes felt when letting go. But the feeling didn't fade. It sharpened. It wasn't jealousy. Margaret knew the difference. She had never believed she owned her son's life. It wasn't fear of being replaced either. Love didn't work that way. What unsettled her was subtler. It was instinct, the kind that formed after decades of watching people closely, the kind that noticed what others missed because they were too distracted by charm and success. She noticed how the woman's smile appeared and disappeared too quickly, how warmth was carefully rationed depending on who was present, how her voice softened instantly when Daniel entered a room and hardened just as quickly when he left. Margaret noticed the way she spoke to waitstaff at restaurants, the slight impatience in her tone, the way she avoided eye contact. She noticed how security guards were acknowledged only when necessary, how drivers were spoken to as though they were extensions of the vehicle rather than people. Small things, things easy to ignore. But Margaret had built her life on small things. She told herself again and again not to jump to conclusions. People were complicated. Stress revealed rough edges. Everyone deserved grace. Still, the unease lingered. She prayed about it, quietly, late at night. She asked not for drama or confrontation, but for clarity, for wisdom, for the right moment to act, if action was needed at all. Margaret was not a woman who interfered lightly. She respected autonomy. She believed adults had to walk their own paths, even when those paths led through mistakes. But she also knew something else to be true. Marriage did not change character. It revealed it. If kindness was absent before commitment, power would not create it. If respect was conditional now, it would disappear entirely later. And once a union was sealed, emotionally, legally, socially, it was far harder to escape. She watched her son laugh, unaware. She saw the way he defended his fiancée instinctively when anyone questioned her behavior. Love, she knew, had a way of blurring vision. That frightened her more than anything. One evening, alone in her modest apartment, Margaret sat by the window long after the city had quieted. The lights outside flickered softly, distant sounds drifting through the air. She held a cup of tea she had forgotten to drink, her thoughts heavy. "I raised him better than this," she whispered, not in judgment, but in sorrow. "Or maybe I raised him to trust too easily." Her heart ached with a familiar conflict. Protecting your child didn't stop when they became successful. It just became more complicated. She didn't want to accuse. She didn't want to create division. She didn't want to be the mother-in-law who saw enemies where there were none. But she also refused to be the mother who stayed silent while danger smiled politely. And so, slowly, reluctantly, Margaret began to consider a path she never imagined she would take, a path that required humility, patience, and the willingness to be misunderstood, a path that would test not only the woman her son planned to marry, but her son himself. As she sat there in the dim light, Margaret felt the weight of years settle gently on her shoulders. She was tired, yes, but she was not finished. Because love, she knew now more than ever, was not just about celebration. Sometimes love was about courage. Vanessa knew how to perform. When Daniel was nearby, she became the version of herself that everyone admired. Her laughter floated easily through rooms, light and effortless. Her voice softened, each word carefully chosen, warm enough to feel inviting, but polished enough to impress. She reached for Daniel's hand at the right moments, smiled at his jokes, leaned into him just enough to signal affection without appearing needy. To anyone watching, she looked like the perfect partner, supportive, charming, composed. Margaret watched too. She noticed how Vanessa's eyes followed Daniel when he entered her room, how quickly her posture shifted, shoulders relaxing, chin lifting slightly. She noticed how Vanessa asked Daniel about his day, listened attentively, nodded at all the right moments. It was convincing, almost flawless. Almost. Because the moment Daniel stepped away, into another room, onto a phone call, out of the house entirely, something changed. It was subtle, so subtle that most people would miss it. Vanessa's smile faded faster than seemed natural, like a switch being flipped. Her shoulders stiffened, her patience thinned. Her voice lost its warmth and became sharper, more efficient, stripped of courtesy. Margaret noticed how Vanessa spoke to the driver when he took a wrong turn. Her tone clipped, her instructions repeated slowly, as though speaking to a child. She noticed the way waitstaff at restaurants were acknowledged only when necessary, their presence tolerated rather than respected. She noticed how Vanessa snapped her fingers once, just once, to get attention, then laughed it off when Daniel looked her way. Small things. Always small things. Margaret had learned long ago that cruelty rarely announced itself loudly at first. It crept in quietly, disguised as standards, efficiency, stress. People excused it easily because it was inconvenient to confront. Daniel didn't see it, or perhaps he did in fleeting moments and chose to explain it away. "She's just tired," he would say. "She's under a lot of pressure. That's just how she talks sometimes." Margaret listened, nodded, and said nothing. She understood love's power to soften edges and blur warning signs. She had once loved deeply herself. She knew how easy it was to defend someone you believed in, to protect the version of them you wanted to be real. But her instincts refused to quiet. The way Vanessa spoke to people without influence troubled her deeply, not because of the tone alone, but because of the absence behind it. There was no curiosity, no patience, no acknowledgement of shared humanity, just hierarchy. Margaret lay awake many nights, staring at the ceiling, replaying interactions in her mind. She questioned herself constantly. Am I imagining this? Am I projecting fear? Am I holding her to an unfair standard? She prayed for clarity, not confirmation. She asked God to correct her if she was wrong, to still her heart if her concern was rooted in pride or misunderstanding. But the feeling did not leave. It grew heavier. Margaret knew one thing with certainty. Confronting Daniel directly would not work. Love would close his ears before reason could open them. Any accusation would sound like bitterness, any warning like interference. And so she considered something radical. The idea came to her slowly, one quiet evening as she folded laundry in her apartment. Her hands moved automatically while her thoughts wandered. She remembered her own youth, her early marriage, the way she had learned her husband's character not through grand gestures, but through everyday moments. How he treated strangers, how he reacted under stress, how he behaved when nothing was at stake. People revealed themselves, she thought again, when they believed no one important was watching. What if Vanessa believed no one important was watching? The thought frightened her, not because of what she might discover, but because of what it might cost her. Margaret knew exactly what this would require: humility, endurance, silence. She would have to step into a role she had spent a lifetime escaping, the role of invisibility. She would have to be spoken to sharply, dismissed easily, overlooked completely. And worse, she would have to watch her son remain unaware. The night she made the decision, Margaret stood in front of her mirror for a long time. The woman staring back at her looked older than she felt. Lines traced her face, evidence of years lived fully, but not gently. Her eyes, however, were steady, clear. "If I do this," she whispered to her reflection, "I must see it through." She packed a small bag, only necessities, plain clothes, wrappers and blouses she no longer wore outside, flat sandals, no jewelry, no watch. She removed everything that hinted at the life she had built, the respect she had earned, the identity she carried. When she finished, she barely recognized herself. And that was the point. The next morning, she called Daniel. "My son," she said gently when he answered, "I've been feeling a little lonely lately." Daniel frowned on the other end of the line. "Mom, you should have told me. You know you can always come stay with us." "I know you do," she replied softly, "but that's not exactly what I'm calling about." There was a pause. "What do you mean?" Margaret took a breath. "I was wondering if I could work for a while. Just something small. I don't want to sit idle." Daniel laughed, genuinely surprised. "Work? Mom, you don't need to work. I take care of you." "I know you do," she said calmly, "but this is something I want for myself." Another pause, longer this time. "What kind of work?" "I heard you were looking for extra help at the house. Just temporary. No one needs to know who I am." Silence stretched between them. "Mom," said Daniel slowly, "are you serious?" "Yes." "It doesn't make any sense." "It doesn't have to," she replied. "Please." Daniel hesitated. He pictured his mother, proud, dignified, asking to work as household staff. The image didn't fit. But loneliness, he reasoned, did strange things to people. Perhaps she simply wanted to feel useful again. And honestly, he thought, what harm could it do? "All right," he said finally, "if you're sure, but only for a short time." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "Thank you." When she ended the call, her hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what she had set in motion. She didn't know how long she would last. She didn't know what she would uncover. She didn't know how much it would hurt. But she knew one thing. The truth was worth the cost. And Vanessa had no idea what was about to be revealed. Vanessa barely glanced up when the older woman stepped forward. Her eyes skimmed over Margaret the way one might scan a piece of furniture, quickly, without curiosity, without interest. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of effort, no question about experience, just a brief assessment, sharp and dismissive. "You're slow," Vanessa said flatly, her voice carrying no emotion at all. "Don't waste my time." The words landed without force, yet they struck deeply. Margaret lowered her eyes immediately, not out of submission, but out of instinct. Decades of survival had taught her when to speak and when silence was the safer language. She nodded once, calmly. "Yes, madam," she replied. Inside her chest, something tightened. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even embarrassment. It was sadness, the quiet, heavy kind that came from recognition, because Margaret understood what that tone meant. She had heard it before in her life, spoken by people who believed position gave them permission to strip others of dignity. Her heart didn't ache for herself. It ached for what this behavior revealed. Vanessa turned away without another word. Already tapping on her phone, the conversation finished before it had ever truly begun. Margaret stood there for a moment longer, absorbing the reality of the space she had entered. The house was large, immaculate, filled with expensive finishes and carefully chosen decor. It smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh flowers. Everything looked perfect. And yet, it felt cold. Aisha, the long-standing housekeeper, approached quietly and showed Margaret where to place her bag. The staff quarters were small and functional, bare walls, narrow bed, thin mattress, a single window that let in little light. Margaret thanked her softly, taking in every detail. That night, as she sat on the edge of the bed, Margaret felt the full weight of her decision settle over her. She had willingly stepped into invisibility. The following days unfolded with painful clarity. When Daniel was home, Vanessa became radiant. Her voice softened into warmth, her laughter returned, light and musical. She asked about Daniel's meetings, his plans, his ideas. She touched his arm when she spoke, leaned into him when she laughed, played the role effortlessly. Margaret watched from the background, carrying trays, wiping counters, moving quietly through rooms that now felt like stages. When Daniel left, everything changed. Vanessa's smile vanished the moment the door closed behind him. Her shoulders stiffened, her patience evaporated. "Why is this not done yet? I already told you to redo that. Do you need instructions for everything?" Orders were repeated unnecessarily, as if repetition itself was meant to assert dominance. Tasks were undone and reassigned without reason. Floors mopped twice, dishes washed again, laundry folded and unfolded. Nothing was ever quite right. And yet, Vanessa never raised her voice. She never shouted. She never used words that could easily be labeled cruel. Her weapon was precision, timing, tone. Sharp enough to wound, polite enough to deny. Margaret absorbed it all. She felt the sting of being corrected for things done properly. She felt the quiet humiliation of being spoken to like a child. She felt the exhaustion of labor that served no purpose other than control. But she said nothing. She listened instead. She observed the way Vanessa's eyes hardened when she thought no one important was around, the way she sighed dramatically when staff spoke, the way she corrected people publicly but praised no one privately. Margaret noticed how the staff moved differently when Vanessa entered a room, how shoulders tensed, how eyes dropped instinctively. Fear, she realized, had become part of the household's rhythm. At night, Margaret returned to her narrow bed, her body aching in places that reminded her she was no longer young. Her knees throbbed, her hands burned. Sometimes her back stiffened so badly it took her several minutes just to lie down. In the darkness, she stared at the ceiling and reminded herself why she was there. Not to expose, not to humiliate, not to punish. To understand. There were moments, quiet, fleeting moments, when doubt crept in. What if I'm wrong? What if I'm misjudging her? What if this pain is for nothing? On those nights, Margaret pressed a hand to her chest and breathed slowly, grounding herself in memory. She remembered the boy she raised, the values she taught him, the future she hoped for him. Truth, she reminded herself, often required patience. And patience, she had learned, was not passive. It was active endurance. It was choosing to stay present even when every part of you wanted to leave. The days blended together. Morning chores before sunrise, silence during meals, the sound of Vanessa's heels clicking sharply against marble floors, the constant feeling of being evaluated, measured, found lacking. Once, as Margaret scrubbed a countertop that already gleamed, Vanessa passed behind her and said casually, "You should move faster. We don't have all day." Margaret nodded. "Yes, madam." Inside, her chest tightened again, not with resentment, but with clarity. This wasn't stress. This was character. Margaret began to understand something else, too. Vanessa enjoyed being obeyed, not because it made things efficient, but because it made her feel powerful. And power, once tasted, rarely softened people. One evening, after Daniel returned home, Margaret watched Vanessa transform once again. Gentle, affectionate, attentive. Daniel smiled, unaware. He praised the house, complimented dinner, laughed easily. Margaret stood nearby, holding a tray, and felt a quiet ache bloom in her chest. Not anger, grief. Grief for what her son did not yet see. That night, lying on her narrow bed, Margaret closed her eyes and whispered into the darkness, "Give me strength to finish what I've started." Because now, more than ever, she knew. She was exactly where she needed to be. The staff noticed her long before Vanessa did. Margaret's steadiness stood out in a house built on tension, while others moved quickly, nervously, anticipating sharp words or sudden corrections. Margaret moved with a quiet calm that felt almost out of place. She did not rush, yet she was never slow. She did not argue, yet she was never careless. Her presence carried something unfamiliar to the household: composure without defiance, dignity without demand. Aisha noticed it most. Aisha had worked in the house for years. She had seen people come and go, watch staff break under pressure or quietly disappear without explanation. She knew the rhythms of the house intimately, the good days, the bad days, and the days when silence felt safer than speech. And she knew Vanessa's moods better than anyone. At first, Aisha thought Margaret wouldn't last. She was older than most of the staff, quieter, slower to respond to sharp tones. Aisha expected her to be dismissed within days, but days turned into weeks, and Margaret remained. Not hardened, not bitter, just steady. One evening, after dinner had been cleared and the house had settled into its uneasy quiet, Aisha found Margaret in the kitchen, drying plates slowly. The lights were dim, the sounds of the city muted by thick walls. Aisha hesitated before speaking, glancing toward the hallway to be sure they were alone. "Mama Maggie," she said softly, using the respectful nickname she had instinctively given her. "Why don't you say anything?" Margaret paused, the plate still warm in her hands. She looked at Aisha, really looked at her. The tension in her shoulders, the exhaustion behind her eyes, the fear she tried so hard to hide. "About what, my dear?" Margaret asked gently. Aisha swallowed. "About how she talks to you, to all of us. It's not right." Margaret set the plate down carefully. For a moment, she didn't answer. When she did, her voice was calm, thoughtful. "Silence," she said softly, "can sometimes speak louder than protest." Aisha frowned slightly. "But it hurts," she said, "every day." Margaret nodded. "I know." Aisha searched her face, trying to understand. "Then why endure it?" Margaret met her gaze with quiet honesty. "Because sometimes endurance reveals what argument hides." Aisha didn't fully understand, but something in Margaret's tone made her nod anyway. From that night on, Aisha watched more closely. She saw how Vanessa's behavior followed a predictable pattern. In the mornings, she was sharp and impatient. By midday, she became commanding, issuing instructions like declarations. In the evenings, when Daniel returned, she transformed. Soft laughter, affectionate gestures, effortless charm. Margaret noticed it too. Each day made the truth harder to ignore. Vanessa believed control equaled strength. She believed kindness was optional, a performance reserved for people who mattered, and she believed fear was an effective tool. Margaret watched the way Vanessa corrected staff publicly, never privately, the way she dismissed apologies without acknowledgement, the way she never said thank you, not once. It wasn't rage, it was entitlement. One afternoon, Vanessa hosted guests. the living room filled with perfume and laughter, heels clicking against polished floors. The air buzzed with conversation about weddings, travel, and plans that assumed the future was guaranteed. Margaret moved quietly among them, carrying trays, refilling glasses, her presence barely acknowledged. As she passed behind Vanessa, she felt the tension before it happened. A glass tipped. Red liquid spilled across the pale rug, blooming outward like a slow stain. "Oh my goodness!" Vanessa exclaimed loudly, rising to her feet. Her voice cut through the room with practiced drama. "What have you done?" All eyes turned. Margaret froze for a fraction of a second, then spoke softly. "I'm sorry. I'll clean it." Vanessa's expression hardened just enough to be visible. "Do you have any idea how expensive this rug is?" she demanded. "Honestly, this is unacceptable." Margaret didn't answer. She lowered herself carefully to the floor, knees pressing into the carpet, and began blotting the stain with a cloth. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Some guests looked away, others shifted in their seats. No one spoke. Margaret felt the weight of their gazes, the quiet discomfort, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, not from fear, but from the ache in her knees and the humiliation pressing against her chest. Vanessa stood over her, arms crossed. "Be careful," she said coolly. "You're only making it worse." Margaret nodded. "Yes, madam." The stain lightened, but it didn't disappear completely. Vanessa sighed loudly, shaking her head. "Unbelievable," she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. The guests resumed their conversation slowly, the laughter now forced, brittle. The mood had shifted, though no one named it. Later that evening, after the guests left, Daniel noticed the faint discoloration on the rug. "What happened here?" he asked casually. Vanessa waved a hand dismissively. "The maid was careless. I've addressed it." Daniel frowned slightly, but said nothing. Margaret stood in the doorway, unseen. In that moment, something inside her settled. This wasn't only about Vanessa. It was about Daniel, about whether he would notice the discomfort in the room, about whether he would question the pattern, about whether he would listen to the quiet signals instead of the charming explanations. Margaret returned to her narrow bed that night, exhaustion sinking deep into her bones. She lay awake, staring into the darkness, replaying the afternoon in her mind, not with bitterness, but with clarity. She had hoped once that Vanessa might surprise her, that kindness might emerge under pressure, that stress, not character, was the cause. Now she knew better. And she knew something else, too. The truth was no longer hidden. It was waiting to be seen. When Daniel left for his business trip, the change in the house was immediate and unmistakable. It was as if the walls themselves stiffened once his presence disappeared. The warmth, thin as it already was, evaporated. Conversations shortened. Footsteps became quieter, more careful. Even the air felt heavier, charged with an unspoken warning that everyone understood without needing it explained. Vanessa no longer bothered to hide her irritation. Her patience thinned with every passing hour, stretched so tightly that even the smallest inconvenience snapped it. Her words grew sharper, clipped, stripped of any softness she once performed so well. Instructions came faster, stacked one on top of another, leaving no room to breathe. "Why is this still here? How many times do I have to repeat myself? Do I need to supervise everything myself?" Margaret absorbed it all silently. She woke before dawn each morning, her body already tired before the day began. Her joints protested as she rose from the narrow bed, a deep ache settling into her knees and lower back. She moved slowly at first, stretching carefully, whispering a short prayer under her breath. Just get through today, she told herself, one day at a time. The work never stopped. If the floors were clean, they needed to be cleaned again. If the counters shone, they were suddenly dusty. If food was prepared on time, it was criticized for presentation. Nothing was ever acknowledged. Nothing was ever enough. Margaret's hands began to tremble by midday, the muscles strained and overworked. She noticed it first while holding a cup of water, the liquid rippling slightly with each shake. She tightened her grip, embarrassed even though no one was watching. Her body was sending warnings. She ignored them. She had ignored warnings before in her life. When her husband fell ill and she pushed herself to keep everything together. When she worked double shifts and skipped meals so her son wouldn't feel the strain. Endurance had always been her strength. But endurance had a limit. That morning, Vanessa was particularly restless. She paced the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, frustration clear in every movement. She snapped instructions over her shoulder without looking. "Margaret, the pantry shelves are dusty." "Yes, madam." "And after that, redo the living room floors." "Yes, madam." "And don't forget the windows upstairs. I want them spotless." Margaret nodded each time, her voice steady even as her chest felt tight. As she scrubbed the kitchen floor, kneeling on tiles that felt colder than usual, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The room tilted slightly. She paused, pressing a hand against the counter, waiting for it to pass. It didn't. Her vision blurred at the edges. Sounds dulled, then sharpened too suddenly. Her heartbeat thudded loudly in her ears, uneven and alarming. She tried to stand. Her legs gave way. The bucket slipped from her hands, water spilling across the floor as she collapsed. The impact knocked the air from her lungs, leaving her gasping. The ceiling swung above her, lights streaking and fading. For a moment, everything felt distant, voices muffled, footsteps echoing as if from far away. "Margaret!" Aisha's voice broke through first, sharp with fear. "Mama, are you okay?" Margaret tried to answer, but her tongue felt heavy. The room spun violently now, nausea rising in her throat. She closed her eyes, willing the world to steady itself. Vanessa appeared in the doorway, irritation flashing across her face before concern could even attempt to surface. "What is all this noise?" she snapped. Then she saw Margaret on the floor. Her expression shifted, not to alarm, but to annoyance. "Why are you lying there?" "I think she fainted," Aisha said urgently, already kneeling beside Margaret, cradling her head. "We need help." Vanessa crossed her arms. "She should have said she was feeling unwell. I don't tolerate drama." Aisha looked up at her, disbelief and anger flashing briefly before fear won again. "Madam, she can't stand." Vanessa sighed loudly, exasperated. "Fine, call someone." As Aisha fumbled for her phone, Margaret drifted in and out of awareness. She felt hands lifting her slightly, voices overlapping, panic and confusion blurring together. One thought surfaced, clearly through the fog. Daniel. The hospital was bright and cold, the smell of antiseptic sharp in her nose when she finally became fully aware again. A monitor beeped steadily beside her bed, each sound grounding her a little more in reality. She turned her head slowly. Daniel sat beside her. He looked different here, without his suit, without the confident ease he carried everywhere else. His shoulders were tense, his hands clasped tightly together, knuckles pale. His eyes were fixed on her face, filled with worry that he wasn't trying to hide. "Mama Maggie," he said softly when he saw her stir. "You're awake." She tried to sit up, but weakness pressed her back against the pillow. He reached out instinctively, stopping her. "Don't," he said gently. "Please." She swallowed, her throat dry. "I'm sorry," she murmured automatically. The word slipped out before she could stop it. Daniel's expression tightened. "No," he said firmly. "This shouldn't have happened." She studied his face, seeing the conflict there. Concern, guilt, confusion. He looked like a man confronting something he hadn't been prepared to see. "The doctor says you collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration. You've been working too hard." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Too hard. The phrase felt almost ironic. Vanessa arrived later. Her heels clicked sharply against the hospital floor as she entered the room, phone still in hand. She glanced at Margaret, then at Daniel. "Oh," she said lightly, "so this is where you've been." Daniel stood. "She collapsed." Vanessa shrugged. "That happens with older people sometimes. They don't know their limits." Margaret flinched internally, but her face remained still. Daniel looked at Vanessa closely, really looked at her. Her lack of concern, her impatience, the way she checked her phone mid-sentence. Something shifted behind his eyes. "I'll handle this," he said calmly. "You can go." Vanessa blinked. "Daniel, I have meetings." "I said I'll handle this." There was a pause. Vanessa's jaw tightened, but she smiled tightly and nodded. "Of course. Call me when she's discharged." When she left, the room felt lighter. Daniel sat back down, rubbing his face with both hands. "I should have noticed," he said quietly. Margaret reached out weakly, resting her hand over his. "You can't see what you're not ready to see," she said gently. He looked at her, eyes shining with something dangerously close to regret. When Margaret was discharged later that day, Daniel insisted on bringing her home himself. He held the car door for her, adjusted her seatbelt carefully, his movements deliberate and protective. The drive was quiet. The mansion greeted us with silence. That night, raised voices filtered through the walls, low, tense, controlled. Arguments whispered behind closed doors. Margaret lay awake in her narrow bed, listening without truly hearing, her body sore, her heart heavy. She knew, with certainty now, that something fundamental had changed. The ground beneath them had shifted, and nothing would ever feel quite the same again. The days that followed were thick with tension, the kind that clung to the walls and followed every movement through the house. Nothing was openly said, yet everything had changed. Vanessa felt it immediately. She moved through the mansion with a forced composure, her smile appearing more often now, but never quite reaching her eyes. Where she once spoke sharply without hesitation, she now paused, just long enough to measure whether Daniel might be nearby. Her confidence had not disappeared, but it had cracked. And through that crack, something darker seeped out. Defensiveness. Every question felt like an accusation to her. Every silence felt like judgment. She corrected staff more often, hovered longer, repeated instructions with unnecessary emphasis, as if asserting control could restore the balance she felt slipping away. Daniel, meanwhile, had begun to notice everything. He noticed how conversations stopped when Vanessa entered a room, how shoulders stiffened, how eyes dropped. He noticed the careful way staff chose their words around her, the tension that eased slightly when she left. These were things he had once overlooked, dismissed as coincidence or imagination. Now they stood out painfully clear. Margaret felt his attention shifting, sharpening. She saw the way his eyes lingered on interactions he once ignored. She sensed the weight of unasked questions forming behind his silence. And Vanessa sensed it too. One afternoon, the tension finally broke. It started with something small. A misplaced item. A trivial error. The kind of thing that happened daily in any household. Vanessa's voice rose, sharp and accusatory. "Who touched this?" she demanded, standing in the middle of the living room, arms crossed tightly. Aisha froze. I I might have moved it while cleaning," she said softly, fear creeping into her voice. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "Might have?" she repeated. "You people never take responsibility." Margaret stepped forward instinctively, her heart tightening. "It was my mistake, madam," she said calmly. "I asked Aisha to help me earlier." Aisha's head snapped toward her in shock. "Mama!" Vanessa turned on Margaret instantly. "I didn't ask you," she snapped. "You're always interfering." Margaret kept her voice steady. She didn't deserve to be blamed. That was enough. Vanessa's composure shattered. "So now you're correcting me? You've been here barely any time, and you think you can tell me how to run my house?" Margaret said nothing. She stood quietly, hands clasped, absorbing the anger directed at her. Vanessa laughed sharply, the sound brittle. "Security," she called out loudly. "Come here." The word echoed through the space, heavy and alarming. Aisha's breath caught. "Madam, please." Two guards appeared at the doorway, confused but alert. "This woman is causing trouble," Vanessa said, pointing at Margaret. "She's disruptive. Remove her." Aisha stepped forward without thinking. "No," she said desperately. "She hasn't done anything wrong." Vanessa's eyes flashed. "Are you questioning me too?" Fear rippled through the room. Margaret felt a familiar ache in her chest. Not fear for herself, but sorrow. Sorrow that this moment had come. Sorrow that it had escalated this far. "Please," Margaret said quietly. "There's no need for this." Vanessa scoffed. "You don't get to decide that." The guards hesitated, uncertain. And then, "Stop." The voice cut through the room with calm authority. Everyone turned. Daniel stood in the doorway. He had arrived silently, unnoticed until that moment. His eyes moved slowly across the scene. The guards poised awkwardly, Aisha pale and trembling, Vanessa rigid with anger. Margaret. She stood straight despite everything, her posture dignified, her face calm, not defiant, not pleading, just steady. Something tightened painfully in Daniel's chest. "What's going on?" he asked. Vanessa rushed toward him immediately, her tone shifting in an instant. "Darling, she's been causing problems all day, turning staff against me. I asked security to handle it." Daniel didn't respond right away. He looked at the guards. "Let her go." They hesitated only a moment before stepping back. Vanessa stared at him, stunned. "Daniel!" "I said let her go." Margaret felt a wave of emotions surge through her. Relief, gratitude, something dangerously close to hope, but she kept her face neutral. Daniel turned back to Vanessa. "Why was security called?" "She disrespected me," Vanessa said sharply. "She undermined my authority." Daniel's gaze shifted to Margaret. "Is that true?" Margaret met his eyes, just for a moment. "No," she said softly. "I asked her not to punish someone unfairly." Silence fell. Daniel inhaled slowly. He looked around the room again, really seeing it this time. The fear, the imbalance, the way Vanessa stood rigid, defensive, while Margaret remained composed. "Everyone else," Daniel said quietly, "please leave." The guards retreated. Aisha backed away reluctantly, tears streaking her face. When they were alone, Vanessa laughed nervously. "You're overreacting." Daniel didn't laugh. "I don't recognize this house anymore," he said slowly, "and I don't recognize this version of you." Vanessa's expression hardened. "So now you're taking her side?" Daniel shook his head. "I'm paying attention." That night, Daniel knocked gently on Margaret's door. She opened it slowly, her body still weak, her eyes tired. "Can we talk?" he asked. She nodded and stepped aside. They sat quietly in the small room, so different from the rest of the house. Simple, honest. "I'm sorry," he said after a long pause. "I shouldn't have let things get that far." Margaret smiled gently. "You stopped it when you saw it." He looked down at his hands. "I'm starting to see things I didn't before." She nodded. "Seeing can be painful." He hesitated. "There's something about you," he said softly, "the way you carry yourself. It feels familiar." Margaret's heart skipped, but her face remained calm. "People are often more alike than we realize." Daniel nodded slowly. "I don't have answers yet," he admitted, "but I have questions now." She reached out and placed her hand over his. That's where truth begins. As he left the room, Margaret sat quietly, her chest rising and falling with slow breaths. She knew now. The questions had begun, and once begun, they could not be silenced for long. Daniel couldn't ignore what he had begun to see. The feeling followed him everywhere now, a quiet but persistent weight in his chest. It sat with him during meetings, crept into conversations, and refused to let him rest. Every polite smile from Vanessa felt forced. Every laugh sounded rehearsed. And every memory he replayed carried a detail he had once dismissed but could no longer unsee. Early one morning, before the house fully woke, Daniel found himself walking toward the security room. He didn't plan it. His body moved before his mind fully caught up. The hallway was quiet, the soft hum of the house barely audible. As he unlocked the door and stepped inside, the faint glow of multiple screens illuminated the room. These cameras had been installed years ago for safety, break-ins, emergencies. He had approved the system, signed the papers, and then forgotten about it completely. Like many things in his life, he had assumed their presence meant protection without ever checking what they truly captured. He sat down slowly in front of the monitors. For a moment, he hesitated. Some part of him still hoped he was wrong, that this discomfort, this doubt, was nothing more than stress, misunderstanding, imagination. Then he pressed play. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Staff moving quietly, Vanessa walking confidently through rooms, conversations without sound, normal life. Then patterns emerged. He watched Vanessa enter the kitchen. Her posture shifted. Her mouth tightened. Her gestures became sharp, dismissive. He watched her issue instructions, then repeat them, not because they hadn't been followed, but because repetition asserted control. He watched Margaret kneel on the floor, scrubbing tiles that already gleamed. He saw Vanessa stand over her, arms crossed, unmoving, watching. Daniel's throat tightened. He fast-forwarded. Another clip. Another day. Vanessa knocking over a glass deliberately, then stepping back as Margaret rushed forward to clean it. Vanessa's head tilted slightly, her body language calm, almost relaxed as she watched the humiliation unfold. Another clip. Vanessa pointing at Aisha, her gestures sharp, her mouth moving rapidly in anger. Aisha shrinking, shoulders folding inward. Margaret stepping forward, standing protectively between them, her movements slow but deliberate. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. There was no shouting, no dramatic outbursts, just control, precision, consistency. Humiliation delivered calmly, deliberately, the kind that left no bruises but cut deeper than force ever could. Daniel leaned back in the chair, his chest tightening painfully as understanding settled in. This wasn't discipline. This wasn't stress. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was who Vanessa was when she believed no one important was watching, and he had missed it. He sat there for a long time, the screens still glowing, the quiet hum of electricity filling the room. Shame crept in slowly, wrapping around his thoughts. How many times had he laughed something off? How many times had he defended behavior he hadn't truly examined? How many times had he mistaken charm for character? By the time he stood, the sun had risen fully. Light streamed through the windows, illuminating a house that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Vanessa found him later that morning in the living room. She smiled when she saw him. "You're up early." "We need to talk," Daniel said. Her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't accuse, he simply told her what he had seen. "The cameras," he said calmly. "I watched them." The air between them went still. Vanessa laughed lightly, though it sounded forced. "You're spying on me now?" "I was protecting my home," Daniel replied, "and I failed." Her expression hardened. "Those people exaggerate everything." "I saw it," he said quietly. She crossed her arms. "So correcting staff is abuse now?" Daniel shook his head. "That wasn't correction. It was management." "No," he said, his voice steady but firm. "It was control, and you enjoyed it." The words landed heavily. Vanessa's confidence cracked, panic flashing briefly across her face before she masked it with irritation. "You're choosing staff over your future wife?" "I'm choosing truth over denial," Daniel replied. Silence stretched between them. "I need time. The wedding is on hold." Vanessa stared at him, stunned. Fear replaced confidence in her eyes. "You can't be serious." "I am." She stormed out without another word, her heels striking the floor sharply, the sound echoing long after she disappeared. Daniel stood there alone, his heart pounding, his mind racing. That afternoon, the doorbell rang. A security guard approached him hesitantly. "Sir, there are officials at the gate. They're asking about an employee." Daniel frowned. "What kind of officials?" "Labor office," the guard replied. "They say there's a complaint about illegal employment." Daniel's chest tightened. Margaret was called forward. She walked calmly, her posture steady despite the tension surrounding her. The official asked for identification, her tone polite but firm. Margaret nodded. "Of course." She reached into her bag. Daniel watched closely, but instead of an ID card, she pulled out an envelope. She hesitated only briefly before handing it to him. "Daniel," she said softly, "there are truths that can't remain hidden forever." His heart began to pound as he opened the envelope. Documents, legal papers, a familiar name printed clearly at the top. Margaret Okoye. His hands began to shake. He looked at the papers, then at her face, then back at the name. "Mom?" The word barely escaped his mouth. The world seemed to tilt. Margaret met his gaze, her eyes filled with love, sorrow, and resolve. "Yes, my son." Daniel's breath caught painfully in his chest. Memories flooded back all at once. Her voice, her posture, her strength. How had he not seen it sooner? The officials stood awkwardly, unsure what to do. Vanessa, watching from a distance, froze in place. Daniel stepped forward, his voice unsteady. "You did all this for me?" Margaret nodded gently. "For your future, for your soul." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, overwhelmed by guilt and gratitude, shame and awe all at once. In that moment, everything he thought he knew shattered, and the truth, long hidden in plain sight, stood quietly before him, undeniable at last. The truth did not explode. It settled. It landed heavily in the room, pressing down on everyone present with a weight that could not be argued away or softened by charm. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the house itself seemed to hold its breath. Vanessa was the first to break the silence. "This is ridiculous," she said sharply, her voice rising as she stepped forward. "This is manipulation. All of it. She planned this from the beginning." Her eyes darted between Daniel and Margaret, searching for an opening, a weakness she could exploit. "You lied to us," she accused Margaret. "You pretended to be something you're not." Margaret did not flinch. "I pretended to be invisible, nothing more." Vanessa scoffed. "You humiliated me. You turned him against me." Daniel raised his hand slowly, stopping her mid-sentence. "No," he said quietly, "you revealed yourself." Vanessa turned to him, disbelief etched across her face. "Daniel, listen to me. She's manipulating you. She staged everything, the staff, the scenes." "I saw the footage," Daniel interrupted, his voice steady but firm. "I heard the way you spoke. I watched what you did when you thought no one important was watching." Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed again. Panic flickered across her face, quickly replaced by anger. "So what? I'm strict. I expect standards. That's not a crime." Daniel shook his head slowly. "It wasn't standards. It was cruelty." The word hung in the air, unmistakable and final. Vanessa's voice trembled, not with remorse, but with fury. "After everything I've given you, this is how you repay me?" Daniel inhaled deeply. His chest felt tight, his heart pounding, but his mind was clearer than it had been in weeks. "This ends now." Vanessa froze. "What?" "The engagement is over." For a split second, Vanessa looked genuinely stunned. Then her face twisted, anger spilling over. "You can't do this to me," she shouted. "Do you know what this will cost me? What people will say?" Daniel met her gaze without flinching. "I know what it would cost me if I didn't." Her voice rose, echoing through the house as she accused, blamed, and lashed out. But Daniel didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply called security and asked them to escort her while she gathered her things. Vanessa's anger filled the halls as she passed through them, her words sharp and bitter, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence in her wake. And then she was gone. The house fell quiet in a way it never had before. Not tense, not fearful, just still. Daniel sat down heavily on the couch, suddenly exhausted. The weight of everything, what he had missed, what he had allowed, crashed down on him all at once. His shoulders slumped, his hands trembled slightly. Margaret sat beside him. "I should have seen," he said quietly, staring at the floor. "I should have protected you, all of you." Margaret reached for his hands, holding them gently the way she had when he was a child overwhelmed by fear or failure. "Seeing late," she said softly, "is still seeing." His eyes filled, the emotion he had held back finally breaking through. "You went through all of that because of me." "I went through it for you," she corrected gently. "There's a difference." In the weeks that followed, Vanessa tried to reclaim control the only way she knew, through noise. Public claims surfaced, carefully worded statements, accusations designed to paint herself as a victim. For a brief time, whispers followed Daniel's name again. But this time, the truth didn't need defending. The evidence spoke quietly and clearly. Footage, records, witness accounts. There was no spectacle, no dramatic court battle, just facts. And facts have a way of outlasting outrage. The matter ended not with a roar, but with certainty. Daniel called a meeting with his household staff. They stood nervously in the living room, unsure what would come next. Many had learned to expect the worst. "I owe you an apology," Daniel said plainly. "I failed to see what was happening in my own home. That will not happen again." He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He didn't give speeches filled with empty reassurance. Instead, he changed things. Policies were rewritten. Reporting systems were put in place. Authority was redistributed. Respect was no longer optional. It was required. He spoke to each staff member individually. He listened. He learned. Aisha stood a little taller after that day. The house began to change, not instantly, but genuinely. The tension faded slowly. Laughter returned cautiously. Work felt like work again, not survival. One evening, Daniel sat with his mother in the living room, the lights dim, the city quiet outside. "I'm not proud of how long it took me," he admitted. Margaret smiled gently. "Growth rarely arrives on our preferred schedule." Daniel looked at her, gratitude heavy in his chest. "I don't know how to make up for what you endured." She squeezed his hand. "Live differently. That's enough." And for the first time in a long while, the house felt like a home, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. The house changed slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. There was no dramatic transformation, no single moment when everything felt suddenly healed. Instead, it softened in layers, like a tight knot gradually loosening. The sharp edges dulled. The air grew lighter. Doors that once closed quietly now stayed open a little longer. Laughter returned. At first, it came cautiously. Small, uncertain sounds exchanged in the kitchen, brief smiles shared between staff members who were still learning to trust the calm. No one wanted to assume safety too quickly. Too much had happened. Too many silences had taught them to be careful. But day by day, the laughter grew more natural. Conversations lingered, shoulders relaxed. People stood a little straighter, spoke a little freer. Work felt less like survival and more like purpose again. Daniel noticed everything. He noticed how different the mornings felt without tension hanging in the air. He noticed how people met his gaze now instead of lowering their eyes. He noticed how questions were asked without fear of consequence. And he changed with it. Daniel began leading differently, not with grand announcements, but with small, consistent actions. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions instead of making assumptions. When something went wrong, he sought understanding before judgment. For the first time in years, he paid attention to how his authority affected others. Margaret watched quietly. She moved freely now, no longer confined to the shadows, no longer pretending, no longer bracing herself for sharp words. She walked through the house with the same calm dignity she always carried, but now it was seen, acknowledged. She spent mornings in the garden, tending to plants with steady hands. Afternoons often found her in the kitchen, not because she had to be, but because she wanted to be. She cooked meals slowly, deliberately, savoring the simplicity of it. Aisha often joined her, asking questions, listening closely, soaking in lessons Margaret never framed as advice, but lived effortlessly. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft shades of gold and orange, Daniel joined his mother in the garden. She sat beneath a tree, the air cool, the city quiet in the distance. He lowered himself beside her, resting his elbows on his knees. For a while they sat in silence. Not the heavy silence of tension or avoidance, but the comfortable kind. The kind that exists when words aren't necessary. Finally, Daniel spoke. "What mattered most in all this?" he asked quietly. Margaret turned to him, studying his face. He looked older now, not tired, but wiser. The certainty he once carried had been replaced by something steadier. She smiled. "Character," she said softly, "shows when no one is watching." Daniel nodded slowly. The truth of it settled deep, not as a lesson to memorize, but as something lived and understood. "I used to think power meant control," he admitted. "Having the final say, being unquestioned." Margaret's gaze softened. "Power," she replied, "is responsibility, and responsibility requires humility." Daniel exhaled deeply. "I missed so much." "You learned," she said gently. "That matters more." They sat quietly again, listening to the sounds of evening, distant traffic, rustling leaves, the faint hum of life continuing beyond the walls of the house. The future ahead was still uncertain. Daniel didn't know when or if he would trust someone enough to build a life with them again. He didn't know how long it would take to fully forgive himself. He didn't know what challenges waited beyond this season. But the path was clearer now. He understood that love required discernment, that charm was not the same as kindness, that silence could either protect peace or enable harm, depending on how it was used. And he understood, perhaps most importantly, that truth did not need force to prevail. It waited, quietly, patiently. Margaret rested her hands in her lap, her heart at ease in a way it hadn't been for a long time. She had done what she believed was necessary, no more and no less. She had endured not for recognition, but for protection, not for control, but for love. As the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, Daniel felt something unfamiliar but welcome settle inside him. Hope. Not the loud, reckless kind built on certainty, but the steady kind built on awareness, humility, and truth. And in that quiet garden, with the weight of the past finally lifting, mother and son sat together, knowing that whatever came next, it would be faced with open eyes. Because truth, no matter how quietly it waits, always finds its way into the light.